I have said that one of the implications of the principle of non-maleficence, or one of the things to which the principle of non-maleficence points, is our sense that it is fundamentally wrong to kill a human being. Let's think a bit more deeply about the wrongness of killing and how one might explain its wrongness. One might say it violates a right to life, a right that was named in the Declaration of Independence alongside liberty and the pursuit of happiness, but also in the more recent UN Declaration of Human Rights published after World War II. Professor Amitai Etzioni has argued that the right to life is among the most basic and fundamental of all of our rights. He says this is so because, quote, all other rights are contingent on this one, while the right to life is not contingent on the others. It seems all too simple to state that dead people cannot exercise their rights. Yet it bears repeating because the extensive implications of this observation are often ignored. When the right to life is violated because basic security is not provided, all other rights are undermined, but not vice versa. Other accounts of the wrongness of killing point to the way it makes impossible further enjoyment or the achievement of further purposes. Consider this passage from Professor Robert Young. He said that killing is wrong because of its, quote, prevention of the realization either of the victim's life purposes or of such life purposes as the victim may reasonably have been expected to resume or come to have. Or consider this similar passage from the philosopher Don Marquis. He writes, "The loss of one's life deprives one of all the experiences, activities, projects, and enjoyments which would otherwise have constituted one's future. The change in my biological state does not by itself make killing me wrong. The effect of the loss of my biological life is the loss to me of all those activities, projects, experiences, and enjoyments which would otherwise have constituted my future personal life. Therefore, when I die, I am deprived of all of the value of my future. Inflicting this loss on me is ultimately what makes killing me wrong." End of quote. Now, I do think it important to recognize that this idea of a right to life, or this idea that killing is wrong because you deprive me of my future of enjoyment, does not quite get at what, from a religious perspective, might seem the fundamental reason for killing being wrong. From a religious perspective, I think the basic idea that killing is wrong because our lives are not our own, but God's. Professor and Christian theologian Gilbert Meilander tells a story about challenging his students to read a passage from the Swiss theologian Karl Barth on the protection of life. He tells about this experience. A student, upon reading Barth, said in the class discussion, "What I really don't like about him is that he seems to think our lives are not our own." To which, after a moment of stunned silence, Meilander says, "I could only respond, if you have begun to see that about Barth, even if it gets under your skin and offends you deeply, then indeed you have begun to understand what he is saying." Unquote. Indeed, I would say she was beginning to understand what most religious perspectives would say about the wrongness of killing. Or consider this passage from the eminent German philosopher and devout Lutheran Immanuel Kant. He was writing about suicide, but what he says, I think, is relevant to the wrongness of killing in general from a religious perspective. Kant writes, "We have been placed in this world for certain destinies and purposes, but a suicide flaunts the intention of his creator. He, the suicide, the person who commits suicide, arrives in the next world as one who has deserted his post and must therefore be seen as a rebel against God. We have neither right nor authority to do violence to our nature's preservative powers or to upset the wisdom of her arrangement. This responsibility lies upon us until such time as God gives us his expressed command to depart
Now, what Kant
this world.
says here about suicide is relevant to how, from a religious perspective, we might think about killing in general. And that is, God has put people at their posts. God has given people certain purposes and a destiny. And for any human being to remove a person from that post, to thwart the purposes or destinies that God has given a person, is beyond our authority, beyond our responsibility. So, from a religious perspective, it's wrong to kill because human life is not ours to take. Human life belongs to God.
So we see here two fundamentally distinct perspectives on what makes killing wrong. From Marquis and Young's perspective, what primarily makes killing wrong is the way it deprives the person of the future satisfactions or enjoyments they would have otherwise been expected to experience. From the perspective of of Mailander, Barth, and Kant, that is to say, a distinctly theological or religious perspective, what makes killing wrong is not primarily what it deprives the person killed of. Rather, what makes killing wrong is that it deprives God of God's authority over our lives. The killer usurps God's authority. The killer takes what belongs to God. Our lives, from this perspective, are not fundamentally our own, but God's. Obviously, we seek healthcare or we provide healthcare in order to preserve life. These accounts of the wrongness of killing help us see the value of that preservation of life. When we preserve life, we enable a person to continue to enjoy those things that make life worth living. Or we might say, from a religious perspective, that we preserve that gift of life that God has provided. Of course, things are often more complicated than this. When life-threatening illness or injury comes to us, particularly in old age when we have grown frail, and the medical interventions that are necessary to preserve our lives actually also interfere with our possibilities of enjoying all that makes life worth living, in such a situation, is it best to abandon our attempts to preserve life? Or more radically, in such a situation where life prospects are meager and medical interventions only interfere with those prospects, might it actually be permissible to kill because life no longer holds the possibility of value or enjoyment to a person? Of course, we immediately think of those religious perspectives that would insist our lives are not our own to dispose of. But might not killing in such a situation reflect a deep appreciation for the gift of life from God, the gift that life once was, but no longer remains? Well, these are the sort of difficult issues we will be wrestling with later in this course, and they are all related to this principle of non-maleficence and to these considerations related to our general sense of the wrongness of killing.